incredible just how quickly the Game Boy modding community has progressed in just a few short years. Specifically with the Game Boy Advance, we've seen an influx of remarkable mods. However, what truly stands out to me are mods that not only enhance our consoles, but also safeguard their longevity. This particular Game Boy Advance that I have here is made up almost of entirely brand new parts, from the screen to the shell, and even the motherboard. It's all brand new, and it's even got a few cool tricks up its sleeve. So, let's take a look. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Today I'll be showing some really awesome kits from FunnyPlaying that allow us to essentially build a brand new Game Boy Advance. It'll of course have a brand new shell, IPS screen and battery, but at the center of all of this is a motherboard which comes pretty much fully built with all brand new components, including a cart connector, link port, and even the crystal. The only things that need to be brought over from a donor Game Boy Advance console is the CPU and RAM. Now, products like this are important as a way to not only upgrade our consoles, but also to preserve them. Often, the motherboards in our original consoles may fall victim to leaky capacitors, corroded batteries, or just general neglect. If some of the unique components like the CPU and RAM are still good, the console can still be saved thanks to these all-new reverse-engineered motherboards. Now, in the case of this brand new motherboard from FunnyPlaying, not only will it restore our GBA to brand new status, but it also brings with it a few upgrades, which I'll be going over a bit later in the video, so stay tuned. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to go over all the parts I'll be using to build this nearly brand new Game Boy Advance. Then I'll show you how to put it all together, go over all of its unique features, review the pros and cons, and of course provide you with my overall thoughts. So the first and most important thing I'll be using for my build is this all-new Game Boy Advance motherboard from FunnyPlaying. It has all new components, including the link port, cart connector, and crystal, with only the CPU and RAM needing to be transferred over. Additionally, it boasts 18 fully customizable RGB LEDs, an updated audio amp, and a new power management circuit. We'll go over all these features in a moment, but another really cool thing are the different colors you can get these boards in. The one that I have here has a clear solder mask, which allows you to see the copper traces, and it just looks amazing. And the icing on the cake are these beautiful, what appear to be gold-plated battery contacts, and from what I understand, the pins in the cart connector are gold-plated as well. Anyway, another cool thing we'll be installing is this all-new lithium-ion battery kit, which comes with a similar circuit board with a clear solder mask, as well as a 1800 mAh battery for longer play sessions. We of course also have this crystal clear shell to show off our new motherboard, as well as the battery circuitry. And to really make this build shine, I'll be using machined aluminum buttons that are anodized in this beautiful red color, and to ensure that we can see our LEDs, I also got these clear button membranes. And lastly, I'll also be installing this laminated IPS screen with a red bezel and gold accents to go along with my red buttons, and I definitely think it's going to be a good looking build. Now, all these parts were kindly sent over by the folks at Retro Game Repair Shop, where you can actually save 10% on everything in their store, including all the stuff that I'll be using for this build by using the coupon code TITO at checkout. Again, that's TITO, T-I-T-O. Alright, so now that I went over everything I'll be using for this build, let me show you how to put it all together. But before we do that, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order, and again, a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Alright, to start things off, let's first remove all the components we'll be needing from our donor Game Boy Advance motherboard, which thankfully is only the RAM and CPU. I'll be using just a bit of hot air to easily remove them. Now, in a previous video, a few folks asked what this device I'm using here is, and it's basically a suction pickup tool. It's handy for picking up chips and small components straight up from the board. Now, this tool isn't required at all to do this mod, and you can simply use tweezers, but it does make picking up these chips just a bit easier. I'll leave a link to the one that I'm using here down below in the description for those that are curious. Anyway, once the RAM and CPU are removed, we can now grab our brand new motherboard and start installing our donor components. We'll start with the CPU. Now, the key to soldering in a chip like this is to ensure that all the pins are aligned with the pads and then tack it in place, always checking to make sure that the pins are always aligned with the pads. Once the chip is tacked in place and aligned, we can then solder in the rest of the pins. I like taking my time and adding just a bit of solder while also using plenty of flux. This will help reduce the chance of bridging pins together. Now, when initially soldering in the pins, don't worry too much about getting a perfect solder joint, as we can always come back later and touch them up. Once the CPU is in, we can now move our attention to the RAM chip and follow the same principles. Once both the CPU and RAM are in, carefully inspect all the pins to ensure that there is no bridging, and if you are unsure, you can always use your multimeter to double check. And if everything looks good, now would be a good time to check our work by temporarily connecting a screen and some batteries to make sure our new motherboard can properly boot up. And everything is looking great so far. We have a Game Boy boot screen, which means all of our soldering is solid and we can now proceed with the rest of the install. After removing the screen and batteries, the next step I'll be doing is optional. Here, I'll be soldering 3 wires to the LCD ribbon cable, which will be for utilizing button controls for the LCD on-screen menu system. I say this is optional because you can actually use the touch sensor function as well. But if you do want the button functionality, you just need to solder the 3 wires from the ribbon cable to the corresponding pads on the motherboard, which is another great feature on this kit. FunnyPlaying made the pads of these buttons easily accessible on the top of the board. After all 3 wires have been soldered, I then fold the ribbon so that it can be easily connected to the motherboard as shown. And this is how the ribbon cable should look fully installed. Remember, soldering the wires here is completely optional. Now we can go ahead and connect the laminated IPS display to the ribbon cable. And one thing I forgot to get on camera was installing the speaker. I pulled this one from my donor Game Boy Advance, but FunnyPlaying also sells an aftermarket one. Now we can go ahead and grab our front shell and start to populate it with all of our buttons and membranes. And then we can go ahead and drop in our screen and motherboard. And here's the touch sensor that I mentioned previously that can also be used to control the IPS kit's OSD. Anyway, now drop in the rear shell and secure it with the 7 included screws. Now, to install our new battery, we first need to remove the battery contacts here, which can simply come out with some tweezers. And then install the battery and power board as shown. I have the battery oriented with the wire here in the bottom left, which will allow us to tuck it in out of the way. Here you can see that the wire fits nicely into the groove where our old battery contacts used to be. Just carefully stuff it in using a plastic spudger. And then just connect the battery to the power board and tuck away any excess wire. And lastly, put the battery cover on. And folks, there you have it, an all-new Game Boy Advance. I absolutely love kits like this. Not only do we have a fully functioning Game Boy Advance running on the original CPU and RAM, but all the other components are brand new, and we have quite a bit more features thanks to the enhanced motherboard. These types of mods are perfect for resurrecting broken consoles and extending the life of these retro systems. So with that, let's take a look at all the new features that this Game Boy Advance brings to the table. Okay, this GBA has a lot going on, so let's start with the simple stuff, the battery. It's USB-C rechargeable and has a capacity of 1800 mAh, which means we'll have plenty of power to run our IPS screen and RGB LEDs. It's a super easy mod to do and can be installed on any Game Boy Advance, modded or not. Overall, just a great kit, and it really complements our new motherboard by not just providing ample power, but also with its clear solder mask matching the overall aesthetic. And speaking of which, let's talk about the all-new motherboard. Firstly, it works exactly like an original GBA from its core functionality, all the way to the trigger buttons, which have just the right amount of actuation and click. But the main attraction of these new motherboards is the RGB LED integration. This one has 18 individually customizable RGB LEDs with 16 on the front and 2 on the back near the triggers. There is a lot of customization that can be done here, so let me run you through it. First, there are 3 primary modes, including an option to turn the LEDs completely off if this isn't your cup of tea. By pressing and holding the A and B button for a few seconds, you can cycle through the different modes. Here, you can see all the different modes on screen, with the first one being a pulsing color shift, which has a breathing effect while changing colors. We then have the solid color mode that is fully customizable, which I'll be talking about more in just a second. And lastly, we have this sort of random flashing colors effect. So of the 3 modes, the solid color one is fully customizable. This is my preferred LED mode, as I find the other ones a bit distracting. To further customize the LEDs, simply press and hold the start button and then tap the right trigger. You'll see one of the LEDs start to blink. Now by pressing either A or B, you can cycle forward or backward through the RGB color spectrum. Then, once you get your desired color for that LED, you can press the R trigger to move to the next LED and change its color. You can assign a different color for each of the 18 LEDs. But let's say you want them all to be the same color, for example, orange. It'd be a real pain to have to change all LEDs to orange, and it may be particularly challenging to get them all in the same exact shade of orange. So FunnyPlaying has addressed this, and all you need to do is select the LED that has the color you want. Let's choose this orange one here, and then simply press and hold the select button for a few seconds, which will result in all the LEDs changing to the same color as our selected blinking LED. Then, to save your settings, press and hold the start button and tap the R trigger again. It's kind of crazy just how much you can actually customize these LEDs on this new motherboard. Very cool. And of course, you can also adjust the brightness by pressing and holding the start button with either A to lower the brightness or B to increase it. Now, in addition to the LEDs, FunnyPlaying also integrated an upgraded audio amp. While I do have the original speaker installed on the motherboard, you can definitely tell it gets quite a bit louder. Have a listen. Now, one of the other improvements made on this board are the gold-plated battery contacts and cartridge connector pins. The gold plating makes the contacts more durable and less susceptible to corrosion. It's a minor improvement, but an improvement nonetheless. And lastly, there is the aesthetics of this board, which come in an array of different colors to suit your taste. And the fact that they place the select and R and L trigger pads in an easily accessible place for adding button controls to our IPS screen mods is also a welcome feature. You can tell just a lot of thought went into designing this new board, and I think it's a fantastic upgrade over the original. Now, some of the other features of this build are the machine metal buttons and the laminated IPS display, but I've actually covered these in some of my previous videos. So that's enough about the features, and let's get into the pros and cons of this build. Starting with the pros, firstly I want to talk about the design of the motherboard. I think it's really well done, and what's even more amazing is that FunnyPlaying has been able to reverse engineer and manufacture several unique components of this motherboard. For example, the cart connector is brand new, as well as the link port connector. Typically for a build like this, you would need to pull these parts from an original console, but what FunnyPlaying has done here is limit the amount of original parts needed. In this case, just the CPU and RAM. Once the FunnyPlaying team has developed a FPGA core for the Game Boy Advance and integrate an FPGA chip onto the motherboard, we'll soon have an all-new system, much like what we've seen with their all-new FPGA-based Game Boy Color that I've covered in another video. So overall, they did an amazing job with this motherboard, with its increased functionality in the integrated RGB LEDs and the audio amp, among other improvements. From the shell, the battery, and the laminated IPS display, all the way to pretty much every part of this Game Boy Advance, FunnyPlaying is providing very good quality replacements and in many cases enhancements to the Game Boy Advance. All in all, this is just a great option that we now have to prolong the life of our old, aging GBA consoles. Which brings me to the last pro, preservation. Having products like this enable us to preserve otherwise damaged consoles. Whether from aging components or damage caused by leaky capacitors and batteries, having these replacement parts available to us allows us to preserve these consoles for the foreseeable future, which is just amazing. Overall, these parts are fantastic and I can't recommend them enough. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows, so let's get into the cons. Now, to be honest, I don't really have too many. The first one, of course, is difficulty. Transferring chips to a new motherboard like the CPU and RAM is definitely a challenging proposition and does require the right set of soldering skills and the appropriate tools. So while these options are available to us, ensuring that we properly perform the mod and not cause further damage definitely limits the audience a mod like this is meant for. However, for kits like the battery mod, the beautiful replacement shells and the IPS display are far easier and more accessible and are still fantastic for the broader audience. Now, the only other con in my opinion is the LED customization process. It's definitely a bit complicated, and unless you're changing the settings all the time, I think a lot of folks will forget how to make adjustments. To some degree, this is unavoidable due to all the customizations that FunnyPlaying has integrated into their board, but remembering the different button combinations is definitely challenging, so I highly recommend writing it down somewhere. But other than that, the fact that we can pretty much build a brand new Game Boy Advance is incredible. FunnyPlaying has really been providing us with the necessary parts to preserve these consoles well into the future, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do next. Well, there you have it. A pretty much brand new Game Boy Advance made possible by the folks over at FunnyPlaying. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next time.